In 2103, a former dweller of Vault 76 arrived at the gates of the Settlement Foundation with an urgent message. This outsider carried with him a dire warning to the newcomers who had entered Appalachia without realizing the danger to which they exposed themselves. Though the region was a practical ecological utopia and was rumored to be home to a trove of hidden treasure, it was also host to the Scorched Plague, a deadly mutagenic pathogen that could, in short order, become a lethal epidemic. I'm the Irresolute Cartographer, and this is part 2 of the story of the Settlers of Foundation. The gate guard greeted the Vault Dweller. When they asked who was in charge of the settlement, the guard sent them to meet with Ward. Though Paige had been the group's informal leader since their flight from Washington, D.C. 26 years prior, he had recently begun to delegate some of his duties to other settlers. As the overseer of day-to-day operations, Ward was less likely than Paige to be too busy to meet with this unknown outsider. When Ward proved to be too focused on other tasks to meet with the Vault Dweller, they moved on to speak directly with Paige. Paige had settled into one of the old rooms in Founders Hall, and thus the Vault Dweller descended the elevator under the observation tower and tracked him down. Upon their meeting, Paige recognized that the Vault Dweller was a Vault Dweller, and remarked that if they had come to evict the settlers, too bad, they were there to stay. When informed of the need to be inoculated against the Scorched Plague, Paige was noticeably worried. The settlers had seen the Scorched and their petrified corpses on their way to Spruce Knob, but they had not known precisely what had created the mutants. He balanced this concern with a healthy dose of skepticism, as he figured that if the Vault Dweller didn't want the settlers around, the conception of such an illness would be a great scare tactic to get them to leave. Paige wasn't an expert on medical issues, but he had a friend who was, Dr. Aubry. Paige explained to the Vault Dweller that if Dr. Aubry agreed with her dire assessment of the Scorched Plague, that he would consider discussing inoculation. Unfortunately, the doctor wasn't currently at Foundation. Just days before the arrival of the Vault Dweller, Paige had dispatched the Pennsylvanian doctor as part of an expedition to establish an observation camp to the south-southwest. The Vault Dweller left at once and made their way to the proposed campsite, knowing just how much danger the settlers were in. The preceding months had been a revelation for the Vault Dweller. In their time scrabbling over the ruins of the old world, they had learned enough to know that the settlers weren't the first group to underestimate the Scorched Plague. The responders had believed that the threat of the Scorched Beasts and their plague was nowhere near as dire as those across the mountains had claimed. When Harper's Ferry fell to a terrible onslaught of the monsters in June 2086, and the Free States members had fled back to their bunkers, the responders couldn't believe what they heard. Rather than confront the terrible truth, they fell back on pre-war prejudice against the survivalists, accusing them of being selfish when others needed their help. When the power armor-clad Brotherhood of Steel later claimed to be in a life-and-death struggle with the giant bats, the responders put this off as a ploy to bilk them of their valuable supplies. Their ignorance of the threat had finally been wiped away in August 2095, when the Brotherhood announced their imminent destruction over the radio and fell silent. In the 11 months after that time, there had been a frenzy of activity in Morgantown, as the responders tried to play catch-up in a fight they had left on the back burner. At the eastern end of the airport, the responders had organized a quarantine zone. It was in this dismal place that Dr. Claire Hudson had been working on an inoculation against the mutagenic Scorched Plague. By July 2096, though she had learned a lot about the pathogen, it was clear to Dr. Hudson that the equipment at the airport wasn't advanced enough for her needs. Thus, she departed alone for the abandoned ruins of AVR Medical in Charleston. Over the next 5 months, she lived alone in the ruined hospital, fighting technical issues, waiting out supply shortages, and hiding from violent mutants when they invaded her unguarded lab. The struggle ended on November 7th, 2096, when Dr. Hudson sat down at her desk one last time. She knew that she had failed in her efforts, and that within days, those of her friends that yet lived would be dead. In the end, she had been stymied by the complete and total collapse of the responders' supply chain under the strain of the constant attacks. Now, the victims of the Scorched Plague besieged the responders' HQ in Morgantown. Knowing that her end was imminent, but holding out hope that some future generation might make use of her work, she set up a program that would simplify the completion of the inoculation for any who might come after her. Knowing that her friends were fighting a last stand in Morgantown, she departed the old hospital and headed north to join them. Just under 6 years later, the dwellers of Vault 76 emerged into the wasteland. In Morgantown, the Vault dwellers discovered Dr. Hudson's notes and followed her path to the lab in Charleston. In following her instructions, they completed her work and inoculated themselves against the Scorched Plague. It wasn't long after that the former Vault dwellers discovered the shocking origin of the Scorched Plague. It wasn't some horrible mutation created by the radiation of the Great War. It was its own man-made catastrophe. In the decades leading up to the war, the government of the United States hadn't been a body of, by, and for the people as envisioned by its founders. It was just one of the corruption-riddled outposts of the fascistic secret society known as the Enclave. This insidious organization used its union of state and corporate power to enrich themselves by funneling taxpayer money into defense contractors they controlled. As the world approached nuclear Armageddon, the Enclave created bases for themselves to ride out the end of the world, including a massive bunker under the White Spring Resort. In the aftermath of the bombs, control of this bunker passed to Enclave member and former Secretary of Agriculture Thomas Eckhart. Eckhart was a big believer in biowarfare and spent the years running up to the bombs building a state-of-the-art bioweapons lab at the White Spring. On his orders, those experiments spread to clandestine satellite outposts in Appalachia. Sometime in the first few years after the war, an Enclave science team had been performing experiments in an old mine. Accidental contamination in one of these experiments converted one of the bats in the mine into a monster that contaminated the environment around it with a strange illness, an illness that would one day be known as the Scorched Plague. When informed of the beast's existence and the science team's plan to euthanize it, Eckhart instead ordered them to make more of the monsters. In late spring 2086, Eckhart ordered the mass release of the beasts. In the decade after that disastrous event, those plague bats had yielded the ultimate destruction of the surviving population of Appalachia, and the world into which the dwellers of Vault 76 had emerged. The overseer of Vault 76 had recognized the danger the newly arrived wastelanders were in, and thus she had dispatched the messenger who had recently arrived at Foundation, only to chase after the settlers attempting to set up a new outpost. When the Vault Dweller arrived at the observation camp, they realized that their warning had already come too late. The camp was overrun by the Scorched, and there were dead settlers strewn about the place. After eliminating the Scorched stragglers, the Vault Dweller investigated the site and found evidence of a survivor having fled the encampment. Following the tracks of this survivor as they traveled northeast, the Vault Dweller found a secluded cave, and luckily the survivor just so happened to be the doctor, Aubry. Shaken by the events of the Scorched attack, Aubry was initially frightened of the Vault Dweller. The news that the Scorched carried the highly contagious Scorched Plague that had created them shook him further. The Vault Dweller offered to perform a cursory medical exam to ensure that he hadn't been infected, but Aubry assured them that he hadn't sustained any abrasions in the fight, and that he had thoroughly sanitized himself in the aftermath. As he wasn't showing any signs of infection, the Vault Dweller cleared Aubry to return to Foundation. They then departed for Foundation immediately to confer with Paige, leaving Aubry to gather his things and collect himself. When informed of the fate of his expedition, Paige was understandably upset. Though he planned to get the full details of the Scorched attack from Aubry when he returned, he pushed the Vault Dweller to get his people the inoculation as quickly as possible. With Paige's cooperation assured, the Vault Dweller departed Foundation and returned to the Vault 76 Overseer's headquarters in Sutton. She had been working on an inoculation distribution plan for the newcomers since the Vault Dweller had departed for Foundation. While the 76ers had obtained their inoculation in Dr. Hudson's lab and AVR Medical, the site wasn't ideal for inoculating the masses, as it was in a semi-ruined structure, filled with mutants, in a city overrun with mutants and feral ghouls. She had considered this and had an alternative plan. They were going to mass-produce the inoculation at the Kanawha Nuka-Cola bottling plant. While this might seem like a crazy place to produce a medication, the bottling plant in question wasn't just a mixing, bottling, and distribution site. It was also the local Nuka-Cola headquarters, complete with laboratory. This laboratory was integrated with the bottling equipment to allow any formula produced to be packaged for distribution. While before the war this had been used to experiment with new flavors and chemical additives, the 76ers would use it to bottle a cure. Well, a preventative, but bottle a cure sounds better. The Overseer and the Vault Dweller traveled to the plant and found it overrun with feral ghouls. After clearing the laboratory of those unfortunate souls, they arrived at the beverage formulation system. Using synthetic antibodies produced from the inoculated blood of the Vault Dweller and the proprietary equipment of the laboratory, they formulated a new variety of Nuka-Cola that included those antibodies in a consumable form. The Overseer gave the honor of naming this beverage to the Vault Dweller, and within minutes, fresh bottles of the newest formulation of America's favorite soda were rolling down the line. Nuka-Cola, my blood's in it. With the inoculant Nuka-Cola in hand, the Vault Dweller traveled to Foundation and met with Paige in Founders Hall. Though Paige was initially skeptical of the soda, he agreed to distribute the inoculation to his people, and with that, Appalachia was far safer for the settlers, along with other wastelanders that also took part in the inoculation program. A second scorching was forestalled, at least for the time being, and the settlers were able to battle the Scorched and the Scorched beasts without fear of falling to the Scorched Plague. With that, the Vault Dweller once again departed Foundation, but it wouldn't be long before they returned, and when they did, they would bring the first real concrete information on the hidden treasure of Appalachia. Not only was the treasure real, but it was also beyond any reasonable conception. Alright, that should do it for this episode. When we come back for episode 3, we'll cover the nature of the treasure, how the Vault Dwellers discovered it, and the recruiting of the settlers of Foundation in a plot to steal this treasure. A special thank you to my patrons, and a thanks to all who came by to watch this video. This has been the Irresolute Cartographer. I'll see you again next time.